Okay, we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Dermot Torney, and I'm a co-director of the Centre for Climate and Society here in DCU, and I'm delighted to welcome you all, and particularly delighted to welcome our speaker for today, Sophie Howe. The Centre for Climate and Society is delighted to host this lecture because a lot of the themes that I think Sophie will be talking about are core to what we're interested in here in the Centre for Climate and Society, whether it's giving voice to those who don't typically have a voice in policymaking processes, young people, future generations, education, policy, governance. There are a lot of themes that are of interest to us and that we're looking forward to hearing from Sophie about today. It's particularly an opportune moment for us. I was talking to Sophie just a few minutes ago about an initiative that we here in DCU are involved in to run a Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss with colleagues in UCC and Terra des Hommes, which is meeting for its second and final session this weekend in Killarney. I gave Sophie one of our branded water bottles here. You probably can't read it from there, but as a gift before you started. It's a really fun and exciting initiative for us, and I know you and your office do a lot of work with not just future generations, but the younger generations of today. Sophie is the world's only Future Generations Commissioner and has been described by The Guardian as the world's first Minister of the Unborn. She took up the post in 2016, and we're lucky to be hearing from her today because her term of office, in fact, is coming to an end relatively soon. Prior to taking up the role, she was the first Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales, where she led programmes to tackle violent crime and violence against women and girls, focusing on early intervention and partnership working. She has served as advisor to two Welsh First Ministers, providing policy and political advice in communities, local government, equality and community safety. She was an elected councillor for 9 years from the age of 21, and she has a background in equality and diversity, having managed the legal department of the Equal Opportunities Commission. Various other accolades, I could go on for longer, but I've given you a flavour of her accomplishments. We're particularly grateful for you making the journey in such difficult conditions yesterday. I think you'll all have been aware of the thunder and lightning and the adverse weather. So we weren't sure at some points yesterday whether the visit would actually happen. And I know also you have a very packed schedule today and tomorrow. So thanks very much for taking the time to join us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bore da, good morning, everyone, and my blessed bob heddiw. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you here today. So as you heard, I'm Sophie Howe. I'm the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. That kind of quite cool description from The Guardian, the world's first Minister of the Unborn, isn't quite right. I'm not a minister. I am an independent commissioner. We have a sort of reasonably strong but recent tradition in Wales around the appointment of independent commissioners required, whose role it is to hold the government and others to account in particular areas. So we have a children's commissioner, an older people's commissioner, and a Welsh language commissioner. I am the newest of the commissioner set, and my role as set out in law in the Wellbeing Future Generations Act is to act as the guardian of the interests of future generations of Wales. So no pressure there or anything. Why, is it so important? I'm guessing I'm kind of, going to be preaching to the converted here. But quite frankly, our future generations, our younger generations, are already calling us out, calling my generation, past generations out on the decisions that they've taken, or sometimes the things they've not done to protect their interests. And actually, future generations themselves, or our younger generations, are making some quite different choices. So they're making some quite different choices to us. They are far more environmentally savvy. We can see from things like the Black Lives Matter movement, they are far more socially conscious. They are thinking in completely different ways about the future or way that we might live, the future world of work. Their demands of the workplace are quite different. If you listen to Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever, he says that every organisation now won't just have one Greta Thunberg within it. It will have tens, if not hundreds, of Greta Thunbergs questioning corporate values as to how they are protecting the environment for future generations and so on. So our future generations, our younger generations, are changing, and they are calling us out in terms of the things that we have been doing. And essentially, this is kind of the position that we have been taking over decades and decades across the world, which is the balance, whatever the question is that is posed, the answer has always been do the thing that makes you the most money, regardless of whether that sort of profit and that economic gain is at the cost of the planet. And the cost of the planet means the cost of human existence, of course. And we can see this as a kind of live debate in terms of what's going on at a UK level. I am extracting Wales from that. We are distancing ourselves, as Rodri Morgan once said, through clear red water between what's happening in Wales and Westminster. But you can see this economic argument play out. And the most frustrating thing, almost, other than the absolute kind of chaos that's happening in UK politics at the moment, is that there's not even an explanation around what the purpose of this economic growth is. Is it to addressing inequality? Is it to improve quality of life? So we've got this sort of crazy pursuit of economic growth at all costs, and we know has been at the fundamental cost of the planet that we live on. So the future is unstable for 6.75 trillion people. If we look back 50,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 million people who, sorry, was it 100 million? Let's see my own slide. Yeah, 100 billion, sorry, 100 billion people who have been alive and are now dead. If we look at the current population, about 7.7 billion. But if we look 50,000 years into the future on current population trajectory, there's about 6.75 trillion people who are yet to be born. And so the decisions that we are taking today, as 7.7 billion, are going to fundamentally affect the lives of those 6.75 trillion people live or indeed don't live. And the stark reality is that our systems of governance across the world don't consider those 6.75 trillion people at all. And that image was taken from a friend of mine, Roman Knarek. He's a philosopher and author. I'd recommend his book, The Good Ancestor, if you haven't read it. And what he says is that effectively we're colonizing the future. We're kind of seeing the future as some distant kind of colony that we don't need to worry about, and we'll just chuck all of our rubbish and our planetary debt and our nuclear waste, and we'll take all the fresh water now, and we don't need to worry about the future. And that is the approach that our systems of governance really embeds across the world. We're really bad at thinking and acting for the long term. There's actually some kind of brain science that sort of relates to this, which is there was some research done which looked at the fact that the different patterns in brain activity when we think about ourselves as compared to when we think about someone that we don't know. And they tested that then when we think about our future selves, it was almost the same sort of brain activity as if it was someone that we didn't know. So even though it's ourselves, we still find it really difficult to make that connection between what we're doing in the here and now and how that might affect even our future selves. It's why I guess, we're so bad at planning for the future. We know that we shouldn't eat the donuts. This is basically me during the pandemic. We know we shouldn't eat the donuts, it's bad for our health, and yet we still do because we're not thinking of those long-term consequences. And that is endemic throughout all of our systems. So when you have a job like mine, Future Generations Commissioner, people generally tend to think either it's about children, it is about children, but I'm also looking to the kind of the unborn, or it's about tech. And when I talk to children, which I do a lot, and they write me letters and they send me their vision of the future, it's really interesting, the kind of comparisons. So you will get this kind of sense of, we are petrified about what's happening to our environment. We are being taught about, and we've seen Richard Attenborough's work on plastics in the sea, and we're absolutely petrified about this. And that's the one thing. And then the other side is all flying cars, and we're all going to live on space, and and all of these sorts of things. And that actually plays out in terms of how the world, I think, thinks about these sort of different elements of thinking about the future. So you tend to get the futures people who are very much focused on tech sometimes, and also kind of existential threat. I can tell you, if you ever want to pick yourself up after a dull day, never ever go and speak to the existential threat people. There is someone called Toby Ord, who is a professor of existential threat in Oxford University. His analysis suggests that there is a 1 in 6 chance that we don't even survive beyond the end of this century. So never go and speak to those people if you're feeling a bit down. You also have then the kind of sustainable development people, the people who are really kind of connected, or governments who are connected back to trying to meet the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Most of them have got really complex sort of metrics and frameworks and so on, and it sort of sits somewhere in government, and it's sort of reported against. Nobody really knows, is linking their actual actions back to what those frameworks are doing, but they are just reporting on stuff that's happening anyway. And then you tend to get the well-being countries. So Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Sana, the Prime Minister of Finland, Scotland actually is a leading nation in terms of beyond GDP and move towards well-being metrics. And of course, Ireland itself just developed its own well-being framework. But actually, very rarely do those things kind of come together. And that's a bit odd in very many ways, but all of those things are completely linked together. Back to the tech point, where people think, future generations is all about tech. And, I think tech will certainly pose part of the answer and the solution to the big challenges that we're facing on climate, on intergenerational health, on tackling long-term health conditions, and very many other things. The problem, however, about tech is, yes, it's part of the answer, but what is the question you're posing about tech? Because there's a real risk that with a purely future-focused approach around tech, that actually we could be sleepwalking into quite a dystopian future. Now, some of you might have seen this film. I reckon if you've got kids, you probably have seen this film. This is the Disney film WALL-E. WALL-E is a robot who is left on planet Earth. Planet Earth is now just one massive kind of dump of rubbish, if you like. So humans have destroyed planet Earth so much that all that's left there are robots clearing up all the rubbish on planet Earth. And poor WALL-E is there saying, I just don't want to survive, I want to live. Meanwhile, humans have left planet Earth because they could no longer live there. They're living on a remote space station. Going back to this kind of colonizing business. They're living on this remote space station. They've become so obese because tech has met their every need. The flying cars have met them outside their door. Their fridges are ordering them food which is unsustainable and not good for their health. They've become so obese that they're living on this remote space station, scooting around in these kind of flying scooters and so on. And actually, the really worrying thing, last week I spent some time in the world's biggest gathering of futurists, and this stuff is starting to happen. People are developing space stations for humans to live on. I met a space architect who is designing the space humans can live in space. They are thinking about these things because already they are planning for the fact that the world will become completely uninhabitable. In this space is a library of DNA, for all of the species that we've destroyed or about to destroy, so that scientists can kind of bring them back. This is the dystopian madness, actually, that we have created. And this is the challenge with trying to make sure that tech, we don't say tech is the answer to all of this. So what is the solution? I believe the solution is a fundamental reform of governance in every country of the world, so that every policymaker, every politician, every person taking decisions is required to act in a manner which seeks to ensure that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is the overarching or underpinning, or however you choose to describe it, principle within the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015. Passed to our Senedd, came into force in 2016. The first country in the world, actually no, I'll qualify that, second country in the world to legislate to protect the interests of future generations. The first one was Israel. Israel had a Future Generations Act. It had a commissioner. The commissioner had some really strong powers to actually veto legislation going through the Israeli parliament. He was so challenging to the government that they abolished him, the act, and his role at the end of his first term. So therein lies some of the difficulty of navigating this role as Future Generations Commissioner. So Wales is now the only country in the world that has this legislation. I believe it provides a framework for others to follow. What else does it do? Well, it sets out 7 long-term national wellbeing goals. And you can see them there. They are all interconnected. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals. I reckon you ask the average person on the street, they'd say, well, of course we should have some long-term goals. If you ask corporates what their long-term goals are, they can usually sort of explain to you what they are. But it's revolutionary. Countries do not have long-term goals. And this is part of the endemic short-termism. We work on the basis of one electoral cycle to the next. We might be doing one set of things for 5 years. We're only interested in whether they're going to deliver any outcomes within that 5-year period before the next election. And then we might do completely different things. And that is why that short-termism in government, policy making, that is why we are in the climate crisis that we are in. It is why we never tackle intergenerational poverty. We know actually what the solutions, what the answers are. It's not a lack of evidence here, it's a lack of a system being able to act for the long term. Now, there are a few other interesting things about these goals. First off, the requirement on all of our institutions, 44 public bodies covered by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, although that's actually just gone up to 50, and it's about to increase again with new public bodies being added to be covered by the Future Generations Act. The requirements on those bodies are to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of these wellbeing goals. Now, that's really interesting in itself, because what that is saying really is that we recognise that everything is connected to everything. Now, previously, I suppose, you get a plan for, you get a goal for building a healthier Wales. And it's kind of, there you go, National Health Service, build a healthier Wales, you do that. Problem with that, actually, is 10% of what makes the difference, with the biggest marker in terms of the gaps in life expectancy. Only 10% of what makes the difference there is anything to do with the NHS. 35% of what makes a difference in the gaps of life expectancy, say the World Health Organization, is income security and poverty. Can you put food on the table? And are you living in poverty? 29% is about our living conditions. What's the quality of the housing that you live in? Do you have access to nature in the area that you're living? Are you living in areas of high air pollution? Really interestingly, 19% is about social and human capital. So when we talk about this kind of fluffy well-being stuff, when we talk about the role of government, which is not about creating communities, it's not about relationships, actually you need to dock that back to the hard metrics, which is it makes 19% of the difference to whether people live or die young. What's your sense of agency in your community? Do you feel that you can make a difference? What's the quality of your relationships? The loneliness and isolation pandemic plays in to those gaps in life expectancy. So that's why everyone having a responsibility to deliver every single one of these wellbeing goals across all of our public sector in Wales is critically important. And the sorts of conversations that are starting to happen. The public health consultant who's been seconded from the health board in our capital city, Cardiff, to lead on the development of a transportation strategy in the city. Because when you apply a public health lens, what was a transport problem, or what is a transport problem, rather than a transport engineer lens, you get a completely different set of solutions. You do the same old and you ask the highways engineer to deal with the problem of congestion in your capital city and you will get more roads. You ask a public health consultant to deal with the problem of congestion in your city through the lens of the Future Generations Act. You get active travel and public transport interventions targeted at the communities with the lowest levels of life expectancy, the highest levels of air pollution. You get cleaning and greening of those communities. You get active travel routes. You get communities coming together because they're much nicer places to be. You get a completely different sense of a solution. And those are the sorts of things that are starting to happen now by this duty to look at all of our wellbeing goals as a whole. The Act also sets out 5 ways of working. And the minister who took this legislation through the Senedd, our national parliament, described it as the Common Sense Act because of these 5 principles. They're inherently common sense. So all of our public bodies must demonstrate how they consider the long-term impact of the things they do, the decisions that they take, and how they set long-term wellbeing objectives. They must seek to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. So this is sort of moving away from this sticking plaster approach to a holistic preventative approach. What I described there is just one example in our capital city, is that holistic preventative long-term approach. It seeks to integrate all of these solutions. So again, this is back to these connections. Everything is connected to everything. We are not going to have a prosperous Wales if we don't have an environmentally resilient Wales, if we don't tackle climate change, because there are no jobs on a dead planet. We're not going to have a more equal Wales if we don't focus on upskilling people in things like the green economy and making sure that they have access to decent work, not just any old work. And I just want to go back to this goal of a prosperous Wales. I'm hoping you might be able to see that, but I'll read it out just in case. So the statutory definition of our goal of a prosperous Wales, a productive, an innovative, productive and low carbon society, which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Now, it's not a catchy definition, I'll give you that, but what is omitted? What's not in there? GDP. We do not define prosperity on the basis of GDP. We are moving beyond GDP. We are putting our definition of prosperity very firmly within planetary boundaries. We are saying you cannot have prosperity on a dead planet. We're also saying, where we go back to, we pick out those key words in this definition: productive, innovative, low carbon, a society that uses resources efficiently and proportionately, one which acts on climate change, one which develops a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work, not just any old work. And that's where even just that definition of prosperity, paired then with the requirements to look right across the other 6 wellbeing goals, that is why Wales is going in a completely different direction to a long-term economy based on the well-being of people rather than profit for the few. The final ways of working: collaboration. We must work together. There's architecture within the Act which requires something called public services boards to be established in every local authority area. Some of them are regionalised. They're made up of all of the key public services, voluntary sector, further higher education, sometimes housing, sometimes business. And they have specific duties to set a wellbeing plan for their area based on long-term wellbeing assessments that they've conducted on their area of the key priorities that need to be tackled in their area. And those public service boards are getting into some really meaty issues now about tackling long-term intergenerational poverty, around tackling adverse childhood experiences, around making the connections between human and human health and environmental health in their area, and really interesting things happening there. Finally, something which we were talking about earlier, involving citizens in the process for co-creating solutions. And you'll notice that this word is not engagement, it's not consultation, it's involvement, a much deeper sense of co-producing with people ideas and solutions that are going to be fit for the future. So I mentioned that the Minister described this as the Common Sense Act. We've legislated for common sense. Kind of feels a bit mad. Why do you need to legislate common sense? Because you only have to look at your Twitter feed right now to know that common sense and decision making is sadly not very common at all. So that is why we have legislated for common sense. So what is it that we're trying to do? Essentially in Wales, we're trying to change the symptoms of a failed system while simultaneously trying to change the system itself. Now, that to me is the kind of the crux of this, because across the world, you know, there's money going into responding to the climate emergency. There's different policy approaches coming out of it. There's lots of talk around, you know, the wider determinants of health and how we take a preventative approach to healthcare. There's lots of, you know, talk and not enough money going into biodiversity loss and resolving some of these big challenges and so on. The problem with all of that is it's still operating within a system which is rotten at its core, a system which discounts the interests of future generations, a system which does not require anyone anywhere to think to the long term or justify what they think the outcomes of whatever it is they're going to do in the long term, and has no one holding that system to account on that. So what we're trying to do in Wales is both address the problems and the challenges and the opportunities that we see, whilst also trying to change that system itself. We like to use this model to think about how we might do this. This is called the Three Horizons model. So perhaps I can exemplify this with a particular case study. So say, for example, the issue that you're trying to resolve is congestion in your cities, your towns and cities, and decarbonising the transportation system. Now, if your kind of sole mission is to decarbonise transport, let me start again. Horizon one is business as usual. We've got congested cities, we've got huge problems with illegal levels of air pollution. We need to decarbonise our transportation system in order to meet our climate targets and so on. Based on what we're doing at the moment, we're nowhere near doing that. So Horizon one, business as usual, and we're going to be on that kind of downward trend. Where do we want to be? We want to be Horizon 3, and I'll say more about that at the moment. What happens for us to get there? What sort of things come into play for us to get towards the Horizon 3? We'll see innovations in a system. Now, if your sole mission is to decarbonise the transportation system, it's not particularly innovative currently, but it would have been. An innovation would be mass investment in the rollout of electric vehicles, mass investment in the infrastructure, maybe like they've done in France, give everyone €3,000 to buy an electric car. There you are, there's an innovation. It's going to help you to decarbonise your transportation system. The problem with that is it's actually a negative innovation because it takes us back to the old, the old way of doing things. It takes us back to business as usual. You'll have everyone still sitting in their electric cars rather than their diesel cars, still sitting in congestion, still not interacting with their neighbours and their communities, still being part of the 56% of adults in Wales, for example, who are overweight or obese. But we might decarbonise the transportation system. If, however, your Horizon 3 is looking at this bigger question of how do we decarbonise our transportation system whilst also promoting connected communities, whilst also addressing inequality, whilst also making a contribution to a healthier Wales, then actually investing in EVs is not the answer at all. Investing in active travel, walking, cycling and public transport is a much better investment. So this model of checking your innovations as to whether they are holistically making sense in the long term, we think is a really useful one. And this is how this plays out, or has played out, in real life in Wales. So one of the early, so as I said, the Act came into force in 2016. Shortly after the Act came into force, the government decided to proceed with plans that they'd had on their books for a long time, over a decade, to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity on building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion on the M4 around one of our major cities, Newport. The plans for this motorway extension was going to go through a triple SI status nature reserve, described as the Welsh Amazon. And as I said, we were going to spend the entire of our borrowing capacity. So I intervened in that issue and I asked the government to justify to me how they considered the goal of a prosperous Wales, which is prosperity within planetary boundaries. Because of course the arguments here, and in fact, the Conservative Secretary of State for Wales said that the M4 was equivalent to a foot on the neck of the economy in Wales. It was stifling economic growth. And, you know, we desperately needed this road to have economic growth at any costs. But that's not our definition in our Future Generations Act. So please explain to me how you've applied the definition of a prosperous Wales to this decision. Please explain to me how this is going to be in line with our carbon emission targets. Please also explain to me how it's in line with our goal of a resilient Wales. A resilient Wales is one which maintains and enhances ecosystems, because it's going to destroy our Welsh Amazon. Please also explain to me how you've considered the goal of a healthier Wales with the illegal levels of air pollution, which will increase as we build a new road, and also this issue around obesity and so on. Please also explain to me how it's in line with our goal of a more equal Wales, when 25% of the lowest income families in that region don't even have access to a car. So you'll be spending the entire of the Welsh Government borrowing capacity on something which benefits the already better off. And finally, please explain to me how you've acted in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, in the sense of not being able to address all of those issues. And even worse, you've come up with a highly dubious policy proposal here in terms of how it impacts on future generations. And you've got the cheek to also ask them to pay for it because it's going to be borrowing. The government could not answer those questions. They had a good go at public inquiry, but the First Minister intervened and changed this decision. He decided that they would scrap the road building proposal. Instead, they set up a Transport Commission with its terms of reference clearly linked back to the Future Generations Act and delivering against all 7 of our wellbeing goals. For half the money that they were going to spend on building a road, that commission proposes 6 new rail stations, massive increase in active travel routes, and a range of other public transport solutions. And that was the beginning, I suppose, of a transformation and a revolution in terms of transport policy in Wales. Because I then asked the government to review the transport strategy that they were operating within, which wasn't in line with the Future Generations Act. So now we have a new transport strategy, which we worked collaboratively with the government on, which puts active travel at the top of the transport hierarchy. We reformed the investment model that is used and that local authorities and others need to complete to get funding. Because on the one hand, what the government were doing was saying, we're putting more and more money into tackling the climate emergency. That's great. On the other hand, you're spending 2/3 of your infrastructure investment budget on building roads. One is cancelling out the other. Can you explain to me how you've assessed the carbon impact of your budget and your spend? They couldn't do that. Just raising these issues starts to get a different mindset. In last year's budget, as a result of that, we've seen our infrastructure investment budget reduced from 2/3 being spent on roads to 1/3 being spent on roads. The Climate Minister announced a moratorium on all road building in Wales, with 55 pre-approved road building schemes paused. A commission set up to review every one of them in line with the Future Generations Act. That will report this autumn, and I am pretty confident that will fundamentally shift Wales towards investment in public transport and active travel and away from investing in roads. There's lots of other things that are happening as a result of the Future Generations Act in Wales. So I talked about those kind of long-term connections between health, well-being and poverty. Our current welfare state system cannot respond to the new world that we're living in. The gig economy wasn't a thing when the welfare state first came into being. Zero-hour contracts weren't a thing. And what we're seeing is those really clear links between poverty and, as I said, and long-term health and well-being. So we need a solution. We need a new solution. I am a strong advocate of a universal basic income. Now, this was seen as a left of field idea even a few years ago. It's too expensive. It's not possible. We can't possibly do it. I produced evidence to show how a universal basic income could contribute across all 7 of the long-term well-being goals. We built a movement of people in communities, in local councils, in NGOs, saying we need a new solution to tackle poverty in Wales. And although this was seen as absolutely a non-starter, what happened at the beginning of this year is the Welsh Government started a pilot of the basic income targeted initially at care leavers, those leaving the care system. For 2 years, every young person leaving the care system in Wales will get £1,600 a month of unconditional income. We will there's a big evaluation being wrapped around that to see what the benefits, the wellbeing benefits to those participants will be, with a view to further rollout if that is successful. We have changed the way that we are educating our children in Wales. We have had huge reforms to our curriculum based around the Future Generations Act, shifting away from rote learning and specific segments of learning or of subjects towards the development of skills which are going to be fit for the future. Skills not just for young people to go into a job, but for them to have a life well lived. So the pillars of our curriculum are built around creating healthy, active and confident learners. So big focus on the physical and mental health and well-being of our young people. They're around creating creative and enterprising learners. So this really important point around creativity being a really key skill for the future. The sort of, creativity again has sort of been seen as the fluffy stuff, but, AI is taking over our world and we need to focus on the things that keep us and make us human, the things that only humans can do, that robots can't do. Only humans can be creative, the core skills for the future. And then the third pillar, to create ethical and informed citizens. Now, imagine if every single one of us had been through an education system which encouraged us to innovate, to be creative, which focused on our well-being as humans as well as our well-being as learners, which described how we needed to consider our actions in our part of the world and how that impacted in other parts of the world, which made us think that we are not just global consumers, but we are global citizens. Imagine if we'd all been educated in that way, would we be in these same predicaments that we are in now? And just a little anecdote about how our curriculum is sort of shaping things. Now, I've got 5 children. The eldest is 23, the youngest is 8. And so I have seen them go through this curriculum. 3 of my 5 are dyslexic, the eldest is, and the youngest is. My eldest fell out of love with school, fell out of love with learning very early on because it didn't cater to his needs, his creativity. His passion for learning was dampened down because the rote learning didn't suit his needs. My 8-year-old, who's dyslexic, completely different. The focus on creativity, the fact that she's been encouraged in those ways, the fact that she's participating in learning in nature in forest schools. And a couple of weeks ago, I was having a glass of wine with a few school members, and one of them said her daughter's birthday was coming up. The daughter had asked for a whittling knife for her birthday. And 2 of the other members said that their daughters had asked for whittling knives too. Now, I'm not sure about the benefits or the sense, perhaps, of buying a whittling knife for an 8-year-old. But there's one small sense of the changes, the exciting changes in our curriculum in Wales, when kids are asking for whittling knives because they've learned what to do with whittling knives, because they've been in forest school and because they're connected with nature. And that makes me incredibly proud of the system that we are creating in Wales, because I can see it through the eyes of my own kids, and I can see it out there. We are going further, because at age 14, my challenge back to government, you've done this brilliant stuff on the curriculum. At age 14, it falls off a cliff, because we start teaching to the test again in order to get people kids through their GCSEs. And we go back to your worth is based and assessed on how much knowledge you can regurgitate in a 2-hour exam. Just a few months ago, the government announced reforms to our examination system. Big consultation that is ongoing at the moment, looking at how do we shift and move away from that kind of assessment-based examination to more ongoing assessment and more collaborative learning. There's lots more to talk about, but I'm only going to talk about one more example, which is our approach to waste. So Wales has had a really strong track record on recycling. So we are third in the world for our rates of recycling, the best in the UK. We're the only nation in the UK whose rates of recycling went up during the pandemic rather than down. So we've got a strong history there, but that is not good enough. We don't just want to recycle the waste that we have. We want to be a zero waste nation. We've set an aspiration to be a zero waste nation by 2050. And what's really interesting about the strategy that's been developed there is, back to that example of, if your mission is to get to zero waste, you're only looking at it in that way, you might do some particular things around tech and innovation and so on. But if your mission is to get to zero waste, whilst also promoting more inclusive communities, whilst also creating more equal Wales, and so on, there are completely different solutions. So our waste strategy our zero waste strategy is based around developing libraries of things, so communities can come together to share. Perhaps the lawnmower that we've all got in our garage is taking up space and we only use 4 times a year or whatever it is. Perhaps we shouldn't be using them at all, actually. Perhaps we should be letting lawns grow. That's another topic. But perhaps a lawnmower that we've got, we don't need to have one in everyone's garage. Can't we share that as a community? Can't we bring communities together in that sense of kind of common purpose and sharing, and reduce the sort of carbon emissions from having to construct and develop all of these lawnmowers in the first place? What about repair cafes? What if you could bring your whatever to a repair cafe and have it repaired whilst also chatting and interacting and building relationships in the communities? What about school uniform swap shops? So instead of the old school uniform going off to landfill, we're actually addressing cost of living crisis and the poverty and the difficulty that some families find in buying new school uniform, and instead we're sharing that and recycling that as part of a circular economy. So that is our approach to reducing waste and getting to a zero waste nation in Wales. And really, this is kind of summing it all up. Everything that we're trying to do is to look at those connections. We're trying to kind of hit a well-being sweet spot where, whatever the starting point might be, we look at things in the round and look at both what we do should be contributing to those 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and then how we do it should also make that contribution. Now, I painted a very rosy and quite exciting, I think, picture of what's going on in Wales, but this is not easy, and still every day I tear my hair out about decisions that happen at all parts of the public sector that are not applying the Future Generations Act. This is a lot, I say this, we always say we're on a journey here. We are on a journey, not a journey, we're on a bloody expedition, let me tell you, okay? This is absolutely huge cultural transformation that we are trying to do here. We are not just trying to unpick the habits of a lifetime, we are trying to unpick the habits of very many lifetimes. We are trying to unpick an entire system which allocates annual budgets, which performance measures you on the basis of short-term indicators. I bet you've got the same indicators as us in terms of your healthcare system. It will ask how long does it take for the ambulance to arrive? It will ask what's your time to treatment? It will ask how satisfied are you with the 10-minute GP consultation you had? We need to get to how satisfied are you with the quality of your life. That is a far better measure of the health of the nation than whether your ambulance has arrived on time. And we should be asking the question, why do you need an ambulance in the first place? Why are you in A&E in the first place? And could that have been prevented? And what are the points in the system that we have got that wrong, that you have ended up in that ambulance? So we're trying to unpick everything here. But so legislation isn't like, you know, it's no kind of silver bullet here. It's really important to have, but it's all about the people in the system. So how have we gone about it? Now, I find that across the public sector, you will see this in corporate organisations, you'll see this in the voluntary sector, you will see this in your own academic institutions. There are these people I call the frustrated champions. These are people who for a long time have been able to see that there's a better way of doing things. The system has frustrated them. They knock against the system. They're saying, why are we doing this like this? Well, that's because, you know, unless you can show me how this is going to give me financial return in this year's budget, I can't make that long-term investment. They're the people who might be the social workers who see generation after generation of one family coming into their social services books because we've never dealt with the root cause of the issue. Now, these frustrated champions are everywhere, and what they tell me is that this legislation gives them permission to challenge the system, and that is incredibly powerful. And when you pair that with a commissioner, I can't get to all of them, part of my role is identifying them, showcasing them, and breaking down, having, you know, banging heads together conversations often with people in leadership in their organisations to say, why are you not letting this person do this? Didn't you know that you have this legislation which requires you to do that? And by the way, if you're not going to shift, I might use my review powers to come in and look at your organisation and see what you're doing to apply the Future Generations Act. So that is powerful. We also have, I think, in the system, these passive procrastinators. So these are the people who are kind of laggards, they're kind of waiting to see what everyone else does first before they do anything. They don't get a sense of some of the really big emergencies and like crises that we're in. The trick here is to pair the passive procrastinators with the frustrated champions, make the frustrated champions less frustrated and get them to inspire the passive procrastinators into action. Finally, there are these people in the system that I call the abominable no men. Now, sorry if there are any directors of finance, legal people in here. Sadly, you are often the abominable no men in my experience. They're the people who say, no, you can't have that budget for the long term. No, you can't do it like this. No, you can't do it like that. And again, waving a bit of legislation at them is really helpful to break down those abominable no men. So I think that what we've got here in Wales is really, really important. There was this quote from Einstein, which says, bright minds or innovators will always be hampered by mediocre minds. I would say innovators will always be hampered by mediocre systems. And we have a whole load of mediocre, and that's being generous, systems of governance across the world. So we need to change these systems of governance. What's happening across the world? Well, I'm here to meet the Irish government, Simon Cuffy, the Foreign Minister, also one of the Green Party ministers. We've had discussions about his interest in taking forward a Future Generations Act agenda here in Ireland. Actually came to Cardiff about a year ago, where he met with some of my Future Leaders Academy. It was a round table with our Welsh government, and he was sitting next to me and said, we want one of her. Great, I thought. And one of our Welsh ministers who was sitting across from the table shouted, be careful what you wish for. Now, that tells me that I'm doing a good job, because if I'm keeping the government on their toes, and that is exactly what needs to happen in every country across the world. So there's interest here in Ireland. The Scottish government have already committed to a Future Generations Act. Patrick Harvey here, the minister responsible for taking that through the Scottish Parliament. Even bizarrely, the UAE are picking up aspects of this. There are very many countries across the world who are looking at this. The most exciting element, however, is that Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has been working with him and his team. And in his most recent proposals to the UN, he has proposed that there should be a UN declaration on future generations, the appointment of a UN Special Envoy for future generations, and reforms to the governance mechanisms at UN to embed future generations thinking. Now, that has the potential to be absolutely huge and to have a trickle-down effect to every country in the world. So we are a tiny nation of just over 3 million people. If you ever think that you're too small to achieve something, this is Wales influencing policy on a global scale. So what happens and what next for Ireland? Well, you've developed your own wellbeing framework. That's a really good start. What next? We started this journey for our legislation through a national conversation with the citizens of Wales. We posed the question, what's the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren and future generations to come? They helped us to frame and form those 7 wellbeing goals. Is this something that could happen in Ireland? I haven't mentioned this much, but one of the interesting things about our legislation is if you look at sustainable development internationally, it talks about social, economic and environmental sustainability. We have a 4th pillar in Wales, which is around culture. Now, I think, there's a lot of parallel between kind of Celtic cultures. So, we're passionate about our language, we're passionate about our heritage. Culture and heritage gets you into discussions and helps you to make connections that are really important to driving these other agendas. Could you be bringing that kind of cultural aspect into the discussions? Could Ireland have a Future Generations Commissioner? There are other countries in the world, the Netherlands, for example, who are still trying to get the governments to adopt something like this, but they're basically appointing a Future Generations Commissioner in waiting to start challenging the government on some of these things. And could Ireland put its wellbeing framework into law to provide that overarching, holistic approach to how we consider sustainability through all 4 of those pillars and link that with wellbeing? The challenge with many countries is that they've got a wellbeing framework over there, they've got someone who's dealing with the SDGs over there, they've got climate policy over there, and none of those things are kind of coming together, and there's often competition between different departments around who owns what, or sometimes none of them own it at all, and therein lies part of the problem. So I think there are real opportunities for you. I hope I've given you some inspiration of things that we've been doing in Wales and the lessons that we've learned, and I'll just leave you with this from the United Nations. What Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. I want you to be part of that conversation of what you can do here in Ireland to make sure that we are all acting today for better tomorrow. Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr.